Well, hello everybody. It is Thursday afternoon. I'm back at school. We have had torrential downpours all day long, so probably going to have to row my boat home. Today we are looking at episode number 14, and I'm going to move my face here around so we can get out of his way. And we're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald today, or beginning to. This is the beginning of the next segment of our series. And there's a lot of mystery, a lot of intrigue around Lee Harvey Oswald. A lot of it is contrived. It was put together in a cover story by the government. They used elements of truth from his past, his background. They set him up. They sheep dipped him. We'll get into all the details, but I want to start to look at him closely and let you make an informed decision based on what was actually true. Winston Churchill, there's a famous quote attributed to Winston Churchill, and he was talking about communism, and because it was hiding behind the Iron Curtain, figuratively, and he used to say it was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And you could say that about Lee Harvey Oswald. It is so hard to separate fact from fiction when you're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald. I think this picture here goes a long way to illustrating my point. You don't know, is this the real Lee Harvey Oswald? Is this the fake? Because there are doppelgangers, there are copies, there are body doubles that the government used to set him up, and trying to retrace his steps before the assassination, trying to retrace his steps pretty much from the time he joined the military until the time he was arrested for allegedly being the assassin of JFK and the cop killer of J.D. Tippit. His background, his whole life story is like two tracks. There's the real one, and then there's the fake one. And a lot of times you see they intersect and merge, and it's hard to separate fact from fiction. So that's what we're going to try to do. The question I get a lot from students is, when did the legend of Lee Harvey Oswald begin? He died when he was young. I mean, so the cover story that we've been taught had to start when he was a teenager. And so I wanted to look at a couple pictures here to show, that the government wants us to believe he was this lone nut. He was antisocial. He was borderline mentally retarded. He was shy, almost withdrawn, psychologically damaged from his childhood, which is what they use as a convenient template to explain the lone nut. I mean, that's why they use the term nut. Lone nut. He's a loner and he's a nut. He's a nutcase, but he's not. He really isn't. If you look here in his teenage years, he looks like a normal teenager to me. Here he is in his classroom, messing around with a teacher. She's they're posing for a yearbook photo, but he looks happy. He looks well adjusted, to the extent any teenager is happy and well adjusted. I mean, we all understand that. But then in the bottom picture, he looks like the class clown, just goofing off. Doesn't look like a future assassin or the image that the government would try to portray. Now, did he have a normal upbringing? No, we're going to talk about that. But he doesn't seem so far outside the mainstream like we've been taught. So that's one of the myths about Oswald, is that he's this lone nut. Another myth is that he was a sharpshooter, that he was trained by the United States Marines. He was an excellent shot, and he was trained by the United States Marines. You can see in that bottom photo, he's on the rifle range. That's him right up front and center. aiming his rifle. The top picture is a copy of his scorebook from all his rifle testing. We're going to look at that today more in depth, a little bit more in depth, to either confirm this about him that he was a sharpshooter, or dispel it as a myth. And so this is the question we're looking to answer today. When did this legend of Oswald being the lone nut, being this sharpshooter, hating Kennedy, uh, hating capitalism, hating democracy, uh, a wife beater? I mean, there are a lot of negative or pejorative terms that have been used to describe Lee Harvey Oswald, and most of them just aren't true. So let's talk about where he's from. I'm going to reduce my picture size a little bit. He's from New Orleans, and in 1939, when he was born, he was named after, his the other Robert E. Lee. Obviously, the New Orleans is the heart of the Confederacy, the old Confederacy, and he has an older brother named Robert, and so he gets the name Lee. So that kind of tells you something about his family and the culture of New Orleans. Very loyal to the Confederacy. Couple of anecdotal things about Oswald. He was never a fan of Abraham Lincoln, which honestly most white Southerners post Civil War probably weren't. He was a Republican. The South was solidly Democrat. And B, he fought the war to save the Union, to free the slaves. And of course, in the South, he was the enemy. So he didn't want pennies or $5 bills, because pennies have Lincoln's face on them, as do $5 bills. So this sounds like a little trivial detail, maybe, but it becomes a little bit of a distinguishing characteristic about Oswald on the day of the assassination, when he goes seeking change for the Coke machine. And we'll talk about that day later. But 2 months before he was born, his real father died. And so he never knew his real daddy. And so he grows up in a house with a mom who is an interesting person, to say the least. You're talking about a woman who now is trying to make it on her own, trying to make ends meet, struggling to do that. And so at various times, she gave him up. At one particular time, when he was just a baby, she put him on basically just dropped him off on the doorstep of an orphan's home for poor children. And so he lived there for a period of time. He was very young, didn't really have any memory of that. By age 6, his mom had been married 3 times, in addition to his real dad. Of course, he didn't know. So that's 3 times in just 6 years. And by age 15, they'd crisscrossed the country. They'd lived in New Orleans, which is where he was born, obviously. Then they'd moved to Texas. And then they moved to New York City, which was a real shock to the system for Lee. Back to New Orleans, back to Texas. So he's been around in a lot of different schools. While he was in New York, he started skipping school in middle school. He hated school, basically. He was bored. So he started skipping school and not hanging out on the streets necessarily, but he loved, one of his favorite hangouts was to go to the zoo. This top picture on the left is him posing at the zoo on one of those days that he's playing hooky from school. The picture next in the middle there is him as a young boy. Not sure exactly what age he was there, but you can see there is a similarity there in the face. You can see the Oswald face. The woman on the right is Marguerite, his mom, and she was always on the prowl looking for a husband, and she wanted to marry up. She was looking for somebody who could take care of her. And Lee oftentimes felt like he was a burden on her. Um, and not necessarily from anything she said to him. It was just inferred. And of course, he had an older brother that had gone to the Marine Corps at a young age, and he had felt sort of the same way. And so Lee just kind of probably uh, identified with his older brother. And so he had, wasn't an ideal upbringing. As you can see, he was with his mom, then he wasn't. Then he was with his mom, then he wasn't. He was in an orphan's home, then he was in a youth house for truancy. A judge put him there. And in between, when he was living at home with whatever man Marguerite was with at that time, he was a stepchild. And there's always that dynamic where, the man in the house is not your daddy. And he probably let him know that. And of course, I'm sure Oswald didn't need to be reminded. One of the things that is almost always true of somebody in Oswald's position where they don't have a strong attachment to home or strong family ties, is they look for something to belong to. Everybody wants to feel like they belong to something, and Oswald was no different. And he, when they moved back to Texas, and eventually back to New Orleans, he joined the Civilian Air Patrol. This was a program back in the day to train people who had designs on eventually joining the Air Force or some branch of the military. And they wanted to get a jump start and learn the military way, that to be a cadet and to begin to get steeped in the culture of the military and join with other people that were like-minded. And so he did. He joined the Civilian Air Patrol, and he met for the first time somebody named Ferrie, David Ferrie. Now, David Ferrie was a captain. That's what they called him. He was the one in charge of this particular branch of the Civilian Air Patrol. They called him captain. And probably for a couple of reasons. Number one, he was in charge of Civilian Air Patrol, but also he was a pilot for Eastern Airlines at the time. And so he was referred to as captain, not just by the boys in the Civilian Air Patrol, but by, at work. That's what his job title was. This is going to be a relationship that continues with Lee Harvey Oswald. It's a pivotal relationship. I cannot overstate the importance of David Ferrie's influence on Lee Harvey Oswald. It changed his life. He was just drifting, trying to stay 1 foot in school, 1 foot in truancy, moving around, kind of anonymous, raising himself in a lot of ways. And then all of a sudden he joins the Civilian Air Patrol and he gets under the influence of David Ferrie, and his whole life changes. I mean, it was important to the point that on the day he was arrested, after the assassination of JFK, when they searched his belongings in his wallet, he had the 2 IDs, but he also had a library card in his wallet, and the library card belonged to David Ferrie. So this relationship, when he's a young teenager, continues to the day he dies. And indeed, in the summer of '63, right before he moved back to Dallas, he spent the entire summer in New Orleans with David Ferrie. So this is a relationship that bears a lot of examination. It really is important. And here is a photograph of David Ferrie and Lee Harvey Oswald together. They're working. You see all the young boys. They're in the Civil Air Patrol. It looks like some sort of a weekend excursion, and they're camping out and they're training in some manner, shape, form. The circle on the left is David Ferrie. He's overseeing the goings on here. And then the circle on the far right is a young Lee Harvey Oswald. And it looks like everybody's having a good time. And this is a photograph that emerged during the House Select Committee hearings when they were trying to establish a tie between Ferrie and Oswald, and Ferrie was trying to deny it, and of course Oswald's dead, and the government wanted there to be no relationship there either. And then this photo appears, and they were trying to pass it off like, well, he was just one of many boys in the Civil Air Patrol. He didn't have much of an influence. You'll see why the government does not want Lee Harvey Oswald anywhere near David Ferrie. Uh, there's an obvious answer to that, but we'll get to that. Anyway, this photo emerged, which sort of dispelled that myth. And then also the library card, that evidence came out. And then a bunch of evidence about what happened in the summer of '63, which in a lot of ways is still kind of a mystery. But anyway, here they are at this working together at the Civil Air Patrol. So who is this David Ferrie? Now you can see just by looking at him, he is an interesting looking fellow. All right. And you would be remiss to underestimate this man because he looks funny. He does look funny. I mean, he was an odd looking fellow. He had alopecia, which is a rare skin disease where you have no body hair. And so any body hair he has that you could see on him is fake. It's wigs, and he made all his own wigs. So they were all homemade. Oftentimes they didn't sit on his head square. They were crooked. He painted on his eyebrows. He was just an odd looking character. And anyway, besides his looks, if you can get past his looks, the guy was brilliant. He really was. He was trained in, and when I say trained, I'm talking like advanced stuff, advanced math, advanced science. When he died and they went in and searched his apartment, they found books. These are books that you would study if you were in med school. Like you're close to graduate, or maybe you're in your residency of med school and you've been trained in specialty, and he's reading these just for fun. That's just his casual reading. They found a submarine in his apartment. He was working on a sub that could go down deeper than most subs and retrieve lost vessels. I mean, this is what he did for fun. These people like this are odd, right? Howard Hughes eventually invents that sub chaser. It goes down. And of course, Howard Hughes was as odd as they come. And he was odd, but he was brilliant. He spoke 4 different languages fluently. How many people can do that? I mean, just that. He was a trained pilot. He was actually considered to be a very excellent pilot. In fact, some of his jobs that he ended up getting with the CIA and the mafia are because of his flying skills. He could get in and out of just about anywhere. And so what makes him even more interesting is the fact that he had that's all his secular pursuits. He had a religious bent to him. His dream was to grow up, go to Catholic seminary, and be a priest. And that was something else they found in his apartment when he died, was all these robes and things from his days training as to be a priest. But that was not to be, because he had a weakness. This is the way he put it. He was a homosexual, and he was kicked out of Catholic seminary for, quote, sexual deviancy. He eventually got fired. He had a very lucrative job as a pilot for Eastern Airlines, and he got fired for, quote, violation of morals clause. What he was doing was he's taking his plane up and putting it on autopilot. He would have boys from the Civil Air Patrol with him, and he would have sex with them on the plane while the plane was flying around. And of course, they found out. So this guy, he's an interesting cat for sure. This is the guy that has become, Oswald doesn't have a real dad. His mom is, here today, gone tomorrow. She's all over the place. he's a burden to her. At least he feels that way. His brother's off in the Marine Corps. So he really doesn't have a father figure. So this guy becomes his father figure. And under the guise of teaching these boys military culture and different things, he's really recruiting. He's an ultra right wing anti-Castrite. Now, what that means is he would like nothing better than to get rid of Fidel Castro. He is an anti-communist. He's working in New Orleans with several Cuban exile groups, which are scattered all over the South, especially in Miami and New Orleans. These are exile groups of people who have fled Cuba when Castro took over, and they came to America with the design on recruiting people of like mind to their cause and then leading a revolution against Castro and overthrowing him. And David Ferrie was helping these groups out. He eventually gets recruited into the CIA because of his associations with these anti-Castro groups. Of course, the CIA at the same time is trying to overthrow Castro, and so they have the same goals. And so they find out this guy's a great pilot, and so he can be a gun runner, running guns down into Cuba, flying in under radar, getting in, getting out without getting shot down by Castro's forces. He can help with paramilitary training with Operation Mongoose, which had bases scattered all around New Orleans, Lake Pontchartrain. And so he starts working with the CIA. Of course, if you're in New Orleans and you do you're an adult male and you do any kind of work for anybody, you are in some manner, shape, or form associated with Carlos Marcello, the mafia boss, because he runs New Orleans. So he did stuff for Carlos Marcello as well, as a pilot, but also as an investigator, trying to help Marcello beat his deportation case that Bobby Kennedy was trying to throw at him. I mean, this guy had his hands in a lot. And while from 60 to 63, he grew to really hate the president, JFK, because, it was a CIA operation that failed at Bay of Pigs. And of course, the CIA blamed Kennedy, and Ferrie is going to blame Kennedy as well. And then when the Cuban Missile Crisis, it appeared that JFK went wobbly, could have used the Cuban Missile Crisis as an opportunity to do over, to get right in Cuba what he hadn't gotten right in the Bay of Pigs. And he didn't. He just put in a blockade. And of course, we now look back and say, well, he did the right thing. But if you were an anti-Castrite Cuban, anti-Castrite in those days, you looked at JFK as a weak, as somebody who was very weak. And he hated him. He flat out hated JFK. I mean, some of the witnesses who talked about, recalled some of the things that David Ferrie said about JFK. I mean, he openly talked about killing JFK. He openly talked about it. And so, anyway, there was no love lost there. So this is the guy who is the father figure for Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, he is, and Oswald even, he admitted to this. He says, the reason I want to go join the Marines, is because of my family. I've got a father, uncle, and both brothers served in the military. And so we're kind of a military family, but David Ferrie had put a bug in his ear. And the bug was, you could go join the military and be an average grunt like your brother and your family members, or you could get into intelligence in the military, and that's where the wars are won. That's the future. And so it was David Ferrie who planted the seed in Lee Harvey Oswald to think about a career in intelligence. And now, this was not just some random occurrence where David Ferrie spoke off the cuff. If you know anything about the fake defector program, which we'll talk about later, they targeted orphan boys. They targeted people that fit the profile of a Lee Harvey Oswald, somebody who didn't have strong family ties and could be sent to Russia as a fake defector. If something bad happened to him, not a lot of people would miss him. Somebody who's moved around a lot, doesn't have a lot of friends necessarily. So Oswald fit the criteria for what they were looking for. So they had their scouts and their recruiters out looking for young men, boys, men who would fit the profile that could be channeled into this fake defector program and end up in Russia. So that is, now Oswald doesn't know that yet. He just knows that someone's taken an interest in him. He's trying to put a bug in his ear about joining the Marines and maybe getting into Office of Naval Intelligence or the CIA, becoming an intelligence asset, agent, or officer. And this appeals to Lee Harvey Oswald. He can't wait. He hates school, and he'd like to just go as soon as possible. So he did. He tried to enlist when he was 16. He got a fake affidavit. The recruiter figured it out, said, "Come back when you're 17." And so, he does. He comes back when he's 17. His brother signs for him, and so you see the top picture there. Here he is. He's happy. He's home, right? This is where he's always wanted to be. He's an enlistee, and this photograph from the bottom right was always his favorite photograph. His wife said this after he died, that when he was arrested and this photo was taken from him, you can tell it's well worn. It's been bent in the middle, but this was an early military photograph of him that he kept with him at all times, up to and including the point in which he finally died. One of the myths about Oswald is that when he got into the military, he had a special proclivity for sharpshooting. And this is one of the convenient little myths that the government put out in its cover story about Lee Harvey Oswald to prove that he had the capability to make those shots from the Texas School Book Depository. And they used as evidence of this the military designation of him as a sharpshooter. And they said, well, he was a sharpshooter in the United States Marine Corps. And, people might have had questions about whether or not Oswald could make those shots, whether anybody could make those shots. Later on, the FBI will put their best marksmen up in that window and try to make those shots, and they can't make them, not in the same amount of time. And so there was some question, how is this guy such a good shot? Oh, he was a sharpshooter. But you have to understand what those titles mean. In the Marine Corps, they had 3 rankings. If you were really, really good, the best, you were an expert. The middle category was a sharpshooter. And if you were poor, they labeled you a marksman, and you would actually fail. You could not pass the rifle test until you'd gotten at least a sharpshooter. You couldn't stay as a marksman. So that would be like in a school, that would be like an F, right? And he could not get past the marksman until like the next to last test, the next to last opportunity he was going to have to take this test. He passed and earned sharpshooter by 2 points. But he was not a good shot by any stretch. His unit, all his men nicknamed him Shitbird because he was such a lousy shot. That was his nickname. So, when the government comes out and says, well, he's a sharpshooter, and yeah, technically he was by 2 points and probably graded on a curve because he was failing those tests. His unit knew the truth. They called him Shitbird. Later, when he does go to Russia, he had a special permission while he was there, given to him by the government, the KGB, to have a rifle. And we'll talk why. There's a reason why. But they gave him a rifle, and most, if you were Russian, you didn't have any guns. You didn't have any rifles. They said, well, maybe he'll want to go hunting, So they gave him a rifle. And so he went with his coworker, and they were hunting. And the coworker had to take the rifle and shoot the rabbit because Oswald couldn't hit anything. Kept shooting and shooting, he couldn't hit anything. So don't be fooled by the sharpshooter designation. That doesn't mean what you think it means. It means you passed. It means you could stay in the Marines. But somebody had a little mercy on him to help him get that designation, or maybe it was just foreordained. It was part of the narrative that had to be. Whatever. Everybody knew he was a bad shot. He was able to stay in the Marines and pass his test by 2 points and become what we now know as a sharpshooter. But he was not, in the classic sense of the word, a good shot. In fact, he was a very poor shot. So these are just a few myths I wanted to look at today. We're going to get really in depth with Lee Harvey Oswald. So this is sort of a teaser just to get us started. Yes, he had an unusual upbringing. And yes, he moved around. He went to a lot of schools. And yes, he had a series of stepdads and he didn't have a real dad. All those things are true, which made him an attractive mark for David Ferrie to recruit him into a future career of intelligence. It doesn't mean he was a lone nut, though. As you will see when we cover in a future episode, this high school dropout will actually do very well training in the military in the Russian language. And the Russian language is widely understood to be the most difficult language for an adult to learn, especially an adult. And he showed a special proclivity for it. This is an intelligent person. And he may not have had a huge circle of friends like some people who live in one spot and grow up with the same people. But he was one of these guys that fit in. He was not an oddball in the sense that people said, "Oh, I always thought he was going to do something." Nobody thought that about him, and he seemed to like the military life and couldn't wait to get into the military. But now, physically, he was not an impressive human being. And his hand-eye coordination obviously wasn't the greatest because he wasn't a great shot. He was an average shot at best. But he was not, as the government would say, I just wanted to really dispel 2 myths today. He wasn't a lone nut, number one. He wasn't this born assassin who came out of the womb shooting straight. He really wasn't a great shot. So when we get to the actual shooting and start looking at the physics of that, the geometry of that, and all the things that go into, you start to understand that this is an impossible shot for one person, number one. So especially when you consider that the one that's getting blamed for all this shooting is actually not a good shot to begin with. So those are just a few. That's when the legend kind of starts. They used his background to pigeonhole him as a lone nut, and they used his training in the military as which every Marine receives the same training with the rifle. Okay, this isn't just for select few, it's for every Marines in basic training. That's one of the tests they have to get passed. But because he was designated a sharpshooter, the military or the government used that as evidence that he was the assassin from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. Okay, we'll get more in depth in episode 15 with Lee Harvey Oswald. And if you like what you're learning in this series, feel free to subscribe. It is free, and or hit the notification bell and or the thumbs up. I would appreciate that. It helps me out. Until next time, have a great day. Thank you.